in this way, Judaism and Christianity actually have the
Differ.
same goal.
Oh,
They just have
okay.
a different manner. Like,
Great.
if the goal is to act well and think well, which I think both Judaism and Christianity want to achieve,
Yep.
Judaism does so in the way where you're like forced to act well initially, and then, of course, your thoughts will become clean from that point because
Yeah,
you're always
okay.
concerned with doing good things. And Christianity seems to attack it from the other side,
Yep.
where the goal is to have purity of thought initially, which will lead to good works,
That's lovely.
whatever
Yeah.
the phrase is.
So
But
that's really
it's
interesting,
all
you
the
know.
same.
Well, thank you guys for coming. I know it's reading week. It's a big effort to come in and talk to me, and you're probably thinking it's a bit weird to have this random guy coming all the way from Australia to tell you about a book. But they told me that you'd like to hear about a book that had made a difference in my life. So this is all a story really that starts when I was like 21. And I went to Oxford having done a degree like you've started out on yours. I finished my degree at the Australian National University in Canberra, went to Oxford to do a PhD, like a graduate degree, in English literature. And in those days, Oxford was very fixed on, and I'd always been interested in both philosophy and literature, not just one, not just the other, but both of them together. And that was in those days quite hard to find a place where you could study them concurrently. So my big decision at the end of my first degree was, did I want to be a philosophy guy or a literature guy? And that's another story, but I thought of it in terms of, do I prefer reading Robert Browning, the poet, or do I prefer reading David Hume, the philosopher? And it was a close call, but in the end I said the poet. So I went for English. Anyway, got to Oxford, and the climate there was very much that if you were doing graduate work in literature, what that really meant was producing a scholarly edition of a famous writer. So what the pressure was to do was to produce an edition of the poems of Wordsworth or a new edition of Middlemarch or something. I don't know what you guys have read in this kind of space, but you get what I'm saying. Like a famous novel, a famous poet, do a scholarly edition with all the footnotes and the bibliographies and all that stuff. And I didn't want to do that. I just wasn't interested in that way of thinking about literature. I wanted ideas, which was a more philosophy oriented way of thinking. And I couldn't find anybody who would supervise me to do what I wanted to do. So they pushed me very hard to this more scholarly thing. And also at the time in English literature, there was a strong push towards what they called literary theory, which is a school of French theory coming from Jacques Derrida, Foucault, people like this. And I didn't want to do that either. So I didn't fit. So this is kind of the cautionary tale for you guys. What do you do when you find yourself in an intellectual context where you don't really fit in? So I spent more than a year in Oxford thinking, this isn't working. I've come here to do this and I'm not liking it. And I'm not really kind of in tune with the approach that most of the professors have in the Oxford English faculty. And then somebody said to me, so meanwhile, I was having conversations with friends outside of the formal learning context. And I got to know one guy who was a philosopher, a little bit older than me, so he was a junior professor. And we used to have long conversations in the evenings about philosophy and life and how you could tell who your real friends were. Your real friends are the ones where he said, they ring you from the parapet of the bridge at 3 o'clock in the morning to say, I'm thinking of jumping, and you instantly run out and go save them. So he was quite an intense guy. Anyway, Mark knew that I wasn't happy, and he said, you should really read something by Iris Murdoch. And I said, who's she? And he said, she is like a mentor for me. So at that time, this lady was an Oxford icon. She was a novelist and a philosopher. Very rare because she covered both those two areas of thought, which is unusual. I mean, how many people can you think of who are great philosophers but also great novelists, right?
Bill Watterson, but like cartoons.
Yeah, well, that's slightly different, but yeah, but imagine if Margaret Atwood was also Cora Diamond or Martha Nussbaum. It was kind of combining those two things, which is rare. And at that stage, Iris Murdoch was a big deal novelist. I mean, I don't think you've heard of her, but everybody in England knew who she was. So this guy, Mark, said, read this book. So he handed it to me as a present. And it still says, to Simon with love from Mark, January 1978, a murky little bubble of air. And the inscription means that when you're drowning, you need somebody to give you a bubble, right? So this was my bubble. And so I read this book and I thought, yeah, this is great. This is what, because the book is about art, read from a philosophical point of view, and arguing that art, great literature, is what we need as to find the good. To actually, it's a better form of moral thinking than anything else. So it was a great book and I loved it. And I thought, now she's in Oxford. So is there any way I could kind of wangle it so that I could have her look at my work or maybe supervise my work? And it was impossible. She'd retired from all of that stuff. She was in her 60s by now, and she was this great lady, and you couldn't even get to see her, you know. But her husband, whose name was J.O. Bailey, was in the English faculty. So I took a deep breath and sent him a letter. There was no internet, right? There was no telephones. I had to write, "Dear Professor Bailey, I'm lost, you know, I want to know what to do." So he said he'd talk to me. So we went for a long walk around my college grounds, Magdalen College, where Professor Ferguson also went. Beautiful. And at the end of that, he said, "I see your problem. I understand why you need a murky little bubble of air. I would love to supervise you. Let me think about it." So I thought, yes, I'm going to be saved. So about a week later, another letter arrived saying, "Come and have coffee with me in North Oxford." So I went to the coffee house and he introduced me to Iris Murdoch. I was thinking, oh, this is so exciting. But it was all very British and very polite as a way of saying, "I'm really sorry. I'm overloaded with PhD students. I cannot take you on as a supervisee." So it didn't work. So I had to go back to the way I was working, and I pushed my thesis in the direction I wanted to. It wasn't quite what I would have wanted. The Oxford years weren't quite what I would have wanted, but I did finish the PhD. And then I thought, not really for me. I'm going to leave academia. So I went into the banking sector in London and then into diplomacy. And then 10 years later, I had a call. So 10 years went by. So now I'm in my kind of mid 30s. And this was from an old teacher of mine who said, "We have a job vacancy at the Australian National University where you did my first degree." And I'd known this guy because he was my teacher. "Would you be interested in applying?" Because I had the DPhil, the PhD. So I applied and I got the job. And you know what? When I got there, I found that 4 or 5 of my closest colleagues all knew the work of Iris Murdoch really well, and were all part of a new movement in literary criticism, which was an overlap between moral philosophy and literary studies. So they were all kind of doing this stuff. So all those years later, 12 years went past, and the little bubble of air actually worked. Because I had this on my bookshelf the whole time that I've been waiting, well, not waiting, doing these other things, thinking, wouldn't it be great to get back to this kind of thing? And I did. So that was when I was in my mid-30s, and I then spent the next 30 years, more or less, as an academic in the space between literary criticism and moral philosophy, and working with people who most of their reading was in a very Iris Murdoch kind of space. So that's the story. So there you go. That's my introduction to why it's not one book. It's actually 3 essays that she wrote in the late 50s and early 60s. And have you guys read The Republic?
Plato?
Yeah?
We've read part of it.
Part of it. Have you read the allegory of the sun, the cave? You've done the cave. Everybody does the cave, right? And there's the allegory of the sun as well. So you've probably done that.
Yep.
And the line where you start from belief and you work your way through knowledge to understanding, the sort of 4 stages.
Do you mean the ladder?
Yeah, some people call it a ladder. It's actually also a line divided into 4. So you've done all of that stuff. Yeah?
I've done those 3, yeah.
You've done those 3. Well done. So does that make sense? Did you enjoy doing that? Do you like the myth of the cave? Was that something that resonated with you?
I enjoyed reading it. I think all the 3 allegories flow well together, like they complement each other. What specifically are you asking?
Well, this is a sort of segue into what this book is about, because she took that, particularly the myth of the cave. So do you remember how that works? Yeah. So we're all sitting looking at the back wall of a cave, and there's a fire behind us and a low wall, and people are walking along behind the wall holding little puppets, and we see the reflection of the puppets on the wall of the cave, and we think that's reality. And some people actually remember this. Some people, do you remember how it goes on?
Yeah. So some people, well, everyone is, the people on the bottom are chained and they can't move their heads, and then they only see the shadows.
Right.
And then someone's freed and he is forced to go out. He doesn't want to.
Correct.
He's scared of the light, but he goes out and then he realizes this is better. And so then he comes back and is murdered by all, hey guys, come out, this isn't real, and then is just murdered. Or first he's mocked,
Yeah,
right?
he's mocked.
Because everything that they learned was good, everything they became skilled at didn't actually matter.
Yeah.
And so he was no longer skilled at finding those things.
Right,
And so,
exactly. And the psychology of what's happening is that they're terrified. They don't want somebody to tell them that reality is not like that they're actually being mesmerized by shadows. It's horrible. And then the rest of the myth is about what happens when you see the sun, what the person who got out actually experienced, right?
could you go over that again? Because I read The Cave with Professor Howland, but we never actually read it for class. Oh, no, we did. Knowing During Making.
Okay. So the rest of the story is, the point of the story is Plato is saying we're all the people in the cave, and some of us get out to go and see the light. But if we try and go back and tell the people who are still in the darkness what is going on out there, they will hate us. They don't want to be exposed as being hypnotized by unreality. And the reality is not just the light of the fire, but it's when you go all the way out of the cave and there's the sun. And he says that the progress of gaining both knowledge and goodness is being able to look at the sun. And of course, when you get back into the cave, if you've been looking at the sun, you can't see anything. But that's basically how the myth works. So that is not the only thing that's important in Iris Murdoch's book, but it's very important to her to think of both. I know that in this university, truth is something that you're really encouraged to think about. Is that's the principle, right? The motto?
Fearless pursuit of truth.
Fearless pursuit of truth. Well, in a way, that's what she takes the myth to be about as well, except that instead of truth, she uses the word good. So it's the good that you are pursuing, not truth. That doesn't mean it's not true, but she thinks of it in terms of the good and of the moral life and what actually is a moral life, and how do we think both philosophically and as writers about the moral life. And look, so that would be a good point. If we can do this for 2 minutes, can you do this? If you look at this handout, because this gives you an example of the way that she likes to think, which is both literary and philosophical all at the same time. So look at page 17. Here's the example. So she's talking about a mum called M, who has a daughter-in-law, so her son's wife, called D. And M finds D quite a good-hearted girl, it says here, but not exactly common, yet unpolished, right, and lacking in dignity and refinement. D is inclined to be pert. You know what the pert meaning impertinent, right? Familiar, insufficiently ceremonious. I know the language probably sounds very old-fashioned to you guys, but this is sort of 1950s that she wrote this. And it's British. Okay, she's Irish, actually, Iris Murdoch, but very British kind of sound. So D is brusque, sometimes rude, always tiresomely juvenile. Don't you love that? M does not like D's accent or the way she dresses. M feels that her son has married beneath him. Let us assume that the mother, who is very correct, still behaves beautifully to the girl, doesn't ever let her see that she thinks all these awful things about her. And let's underline this, let's emphasize that they've emigrated, or even that D is now dead, because this is a thought experiment. Everything that's going to happen is entirely in her mind. It's nothing to do with her behavior. It's about how the moral world is something that goes on inside your mind. So time passes. So you got that picture. Can you tell me about any examples like this in your own life? So either it could be a friend, it could be a family member, it could be the way that you suspect an older person thinks about you, or friends, or things that you. So somehow somebody makes you think, but you're not going to say so. Does that? Have you got an example of that?
Well, I can't expose myself, but yeah.
Sure. Go ahead.
I would say that a lot of the time, so there's certain people that I have to act cordially with,
Right.
but I really dislike
Don't want
them.
to.
And so, and it ends up always coming, like, I don't think that you can actually keep it all in your head. I think that people instinctually understand if you do not like them.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult if you don't like someone to also then completely be cordial and be completely open. And when people don't realize that you're not open with them, they get the message.
Right. Okay.
So.
Oh, that's okay. That's interesting. What have you got any experiences like that you can share?
I guess I do. I just don't think it's fair to treat someone in this way. And it's not that of course, you should be kind to someone you don't like, but that's also part of the problem. If you really have like a problem with this other person, in this case it would be the
Daughter-in-law.
daughter-in-law, then you should tell them and try to figure it out in a kind way also.
Right.
Perhaps even in a fake way, I would say that's fine as well.
Right.
But it's not fair to the other person who might think that you really are approving of their behavior.
Right. Okay. That's interesting. So no, you go. Yeah.
It's not exactly about behavior, it's about personality conflicts. And if you have a personality conflict with somebody, first of all, that means you don't like them, and that's like a very personal thing. It's not that I don't like what you're doing, it's that I don't like you. And also, if those people are friends with the people you're friends with, then you have a very hard line to walk, because you don't want to first exclude them from their own circle of friends. You don't want to exclude yourself from your circle of friends. And I guess this is just more a female thing probably, and I'm just understanding it more. I try to be, I mean, and there's also people that if they do things that are irksome to you, but if they're very sensitive to being told that they're doing irksome things, then it's like, it's a very difficult dance to play.
Sure. Yeah.
And just, if you don't, yeah.
That is interesting. And what both of you are talking about is absolutely what she's on about here, which is a moral struggle that goes on in your mind at some point in dealing with this person that you ought to be nicer to, or ought to be more honest with, which is what you're saying, or somebody that you feel you ought to try and work on your feelings about so you can kind of understand them better or something, right? Which is kind of what you're saying, right?
Yeah, you should, write in your diary or something, try to get out all the anger. It's a lot of, also, my grandma, who's a psychiatrist, would say a lot is the things you dislike about other people, you dislike in yourself.
So this takes us to the second part of this little passage, okay, which is where she's trying to make the point about moral thinking that the whole book in a way is about. I mean, picking one passage out of a whole book is not necessarily representative, but I hope you'll see what I mean. So, yeah, thank you. So she says, thus much for M's first thoughts about D. Time passes, and it could be that M settles down with a hardened sense of grievance and a fixed picture of D, imprisoned by the cliche, my poor son has married a silly, vulgar girl. And by the way, guys, take a step back. This is very English, right? You behave well. It's all about good behavior. She's not going to tell the girl what she thinks. She's not going to make the son feel embarrassed or uncomfortable. It's all going on in her head. The whole point of this little thought experiment, it's happening inside M's head. And she said, let's assume they've emigrated or D died. So in a way, it isn't actually about, like what you were saying, it's not in the end about her behavior to D at all. It's about something to do with what's happening inside her own mind. So let's read on. The M of the example is an intelligent and well-intentioned person, capable of self-criticism. So this is where you fit in, Emma. Capable of giving careful and just attention. Attention is just this word that keeps coming back all the way through the book, and it's a word I think is like one of the most important moral words that there is. Moral in, not moral in the kind of normative, judgy sense, moral in the sense of the texture of a person's being, what a person's self, right, is actually like. She uses this word attention a lot. Have you come across the writer Simone Weil?
No.
Okay, well, that's another one you might want to make a note about. She's a French philosopher of the kind of Second World War era, and she's wonderful. I mean, the best book is probably called Gravity and Grace, but she talks about attention as the key moral disposition, moral attitude that you can have towards another person or towards a book or towards anything that you're focused on. She doesn't think about truth, but about attention, really paying attention. Anyway, so Murdoch is using this word attention, and it's a kind of homage to Simone Weil without saying so. To an attention to an object which confronts her. So in this case, the object is the other person, right? M tells herself, so here's her writing in her diary, Emma, okay, like you were saying, I am old-fashioned, I am conventional, I may be prejudiced, I may be narrow-minded, I may be snobbish, I'm certainly jealous. Let me look again. And this idea of looking all the way through the book, every other person is like something you have to look at, you have to pay attention to, you have to really think about, and then think about yourself. Here I assume that M observes D or reflects deliberately about D until gradually her vision alters. If we take D to be now absent or dead, this can make it clear that the change is not in D's behaviour, but in M's mind. So, stage 2, D is discovered to be not vulgar, but refreshingly simple. Okay. Not undignified, but spontaneous. Not noisy, but gay. Sorry, this is the 50s. So gay doesn't mean gay. Gay means cheerful. Not tiresomely juvenile, but delightfully youthful. Don't you love these expressions? You tiresomely juvenile person. But delightfully youthful, and so on. And as I say, ex hypothesi, meaning this was the whole setup of the argument, M's outward behaviour, beautiful from the start, perfect behaviour. She never gives away what she thinks. The behaviour never alters, but her moral vocabulary around D changes. So what do you think of that as a way of what you might write in your diary? You know, think of a separate, what's the word I'm looking for, contrary set of moral terms to the ones that you used in the first place. How does that grab you?
Well, I mean, I think that I believe in like open mindset. So I do think that reframing.
As the saying goes, you should never be so open-minded that your brain falls
Yeah.
out. Right. Okay.
I mean, I don't know if this would exactly work, but saying that it does, you're saying that your observations of the world and the world is a different thing, and you just have to change. It seems like, I don't know if it's moral relativism or it's very weird. It's all about your interior morality.
It is.
Versus your exterior morality. It's very like maybe Christianity versus Judaism thing, because like
Tell me about,
Eitan can say more about it, but like
tell me about that.
yeah.
I was going to make a similar comment. I think, well, obviously, I care more about, it's not obvious, but I tend to care more about action than thoughts. I think
Okay.
the way it manifests is what's important to other people, and thus morality is only concerned with action. When discussing relationship with God, obviously that changes, but when it's interpersonal, it doesn't matter what you think. It doesn't matter how vulgar it is. In this case, the mother does not discriminate with her action. Like
No.
whether she feels a certain way or convinces herself of something more positive, her actions are always good. And
Or in the example that Murdoch's given us, her actions are irrelevant, because the whole point of this setup is it's not about her actions. It's contrary to what you're saying.
it's not about her action. I think it's not about her thoughts, because her actions remain the same, and the thoughts are what changed. And if we're
Right,
concerned about
right.
morality, which would be,
But you think morality is entirely action based. right?
Yes. When it comes to other people, it is 100% only action, in my opinion. And
So
like,
you really need to read Iris Murdoch.
okay, I'm happy
You'd
to be
find
convinced
it.
otherwise, but
No, I'm not saying that you're wrong. I'm saying that this is a nuance that you might like to think about
mhm.
to kind of weave into the idea that morality is entirely action based. Okay, and so look at so here's the last little bit of her case. If you flip to the end of page 19, I think it's the page you're still on, but bottom right hand corner. The idea which we're trying to make sense of, this is the last 4 lines, is that M has, in the interim, been active. Okay? So it's a matter of what you think action is. Action isn't necessarily just behavior, which is what you're saying it is, right? What Murdoch is saying is that she has been doing something, something which we approve of, probably, maybe, something which is somehow worth doing in itself. M has been morally active in the interim. This is what we want to say and to be philosophically permitted to say. So that's kind of the end of this little example that I wanted to talk about with you guys. So what do you think of that? So she's actually saying, Aitan, think again about the notion of action. It isn't just behavior, but the stuff that's the kind of journey that she's gone on, that she's traveled inside her head using this range of moral concepts is action, is another kind, not the only kind of action, but it is action.
Okay.
Let me put that to you.
I'm not entirely convinced yet. I think there's something here. I don't think it's necessarily fair to label this as action when it's internal. I guess the difference between thought and action, in the way I'm using it, I should probably define my terms, is action would just be anything someone else can recognize, and it affects them in a different way when you change.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, the mother changes how she thinks.
Mm-hmm.
She changes her perspective entirely, and her action, like the way that she's perceived by the rest of the world, does not change in the slightest.
Right.
And the daughter or the son or the daughter-in-law or the son or any other family nearby who's like watching how the mother interacts with the daughter-in-law would not be able to notice
Right.
that the mother has entirely changed her vision.
Right.
And from their perspective, she's just as good either way because they don't know what she thinks.
Yeah.
They
Okay.
only know how she acts.
You go. Yeah.
Would you want to interact with someone on a daily basis who despises you but pretends not to?
This goes back to my comment in the beginning that it's not fair to the other person to put on this act. If action is the only thing that matters, then we need to, well, it's not the only thing that matters because good thoughts lead to good actions. But if action is what matters to people that you're interacting with, then you have to be honest with them about what you like and don't like. And no one wants to be lied to or realize that the relationship with another person is fake. And that's why you have to like understand why this person is being fake or why this person is choosing like to go against their internal feelings just to be nice.
But doesn't that go against what you're saying? So there's, on the one hand, there's, okay, so perfect action, but not matched with perfect thought. And that's, are you saying that's fine?
I'm saying the action is necessary, and okay, the action is what matters to other people, and how you relate to other people is what morality is concerned with.
So I'm thinking, Aidan, I'm thinking of a kind of a micro variation of this case that Murdoch has described, which is where you first meet somebody. So supposing there's another student in the course, I mean, you guys will know each other by now, but early on, somebody didn't make it that great of an impression on you. Whatever the reason was, they seemed, I don't know, conceited or I don't know, whatever it is, whatever word of opprobrium you guys would use, not cool in some way. And that was your immediate impression. And then you kind of went off for lunch or something and you thought, well, yeah, maybe I'm being unfair. Have I really interpreted the way that they were acting fairly? Is there another way I should have thought about it? And then you go back and you see them again. And this time they may be behaving in exactly the same way, but you're saying, yeah, but I'm not really kind of being fair about the way they're behaving. I need to readjust the way I'm thinking about them. Has that never happened to you? Even quite quickly, your first impression of somebody is a bit negative, and then a bit later on it kind of changes, not necessarily because they're doing anything different, but because you're thinking a bit differently.
Right. Yes, of course, that's happened to me. that's part of the nature
Of human
University of
interaction,
Boston.
yeah.
Like, it's a bunch of ambitious students all in the same place. And of course, people are going to speak initially in an ambitious manner.
Yeah.
And then as we discuss more and debate,
You
we all
kind of
become,
realize they're kind of
yes, there's like a
human
certain
after all.
intellectual humility that
Yeah.
most of us have now.
Exactly.
And it's very admirable, if you ask me.
I agree.
I was kind of referring to the unfairness of me being fake to this other person. Like, they think that we have some sort of friendly relationship, when in reality, I might be just faking it because it's necessary to be kind to
Yeah.
other people in a small area. And to not confront him and discuss
I get what you're
with
saying.
the other person.
I get what
that
you're
is the
saying.
unfairness.
Yeah, I get that. And in a way, I don't think, I mean, you can play with this example that she's given a lot. You can tweak it. And I don't think she would disagree with what you're saying. It's just that this M has suspended judgment for longer than we probably would. And I suspect also, even though she set the case up and said, look, we were imagining that D has died or moved away, so she's never going to see her again. But in fact, having gone through this this action that Murdoch is saying she's done, if she ever did see her again, she would be different. She has actually changed. So she is bringing her thoughts in line with her behavior in a way that they weren't at the beginning. So that's, even by your criteria, that is moral improvement, right?
I would say it's moral improvement. I'm going to hand it off to second. I just want to make
Yeah.
one last comment.
Sure.
Which is, obviously, in theory, what I'm saying might sound whatever nice or like useful, but in practice, you're going to have relationships that are trivial.
Yeah.
Like,
Sure. Yeah.
like a person you met one time, you don't need to reconcile your thoughts with them about them, but your roommate or your good friend, of course, you need to discuss with them
Yeah.
and be real.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very true.
With the
Yeah.
classmate example, it might be a little bit more trivial, although it's still important because it's a small institution.
Yeah, and don't forget, kind of sidebar, don't forget that your classmates, as is the case with my classmates from when I was your age, some of them might still be your friends when you're my age. So you're starting out I hope, starting out on a long journey with the other guys in your group. So that's important too.
But Eitan, you're saying that, well, and maybe I'm misunderstanding you, but that, well, maybe you've also changed what you're thinking, because it seems clear that your thoughts, your actions depend on your thoughts. So thoughts in some way do have morality, because to be, completely like expressive and nice to a person that you absolutely despise, and let's say this is a person you have to deal with constantly, is that right to someone? Like, is that a lie, or is that just acting morally, and you can completely take away your thoughts? Like, let's say you don't actually change your, like, let's say it's a personality conflict, and some people have irreconcilable personality conflicts, and people are just irritating to other people. Like, is it a lie to just keep being like, oh my gosh, hello, you're so nice, like, I love you, like, all the time?
Okay, well, there's two
So
options.
you go, and then I want to come back
One
to
of them
something.
is exactly what's happening in the story, where the mother paints a new picture in her head and realizes that this non-trivial relationship
Yeah.
with her daughter-in-law is so important that she needs to
Yeah.
realize why
Yeah.
these differences in personalities are so important.
Exactly.
And that they're actually a good thing in their relationship with each other to have these differences, for example.
Exactly.
I would say, I guess I'll just draw the difference between Judaism and Christianity here in what we're talking about. It seems
Yes,
that-
this is interesting to me that you think in that way, because Jewish friends that I've had have always emphasized the importance of doing, of how you actually act. And that's what I'm hearing from you too. And I'm not saying that's wrong. It is just a different emphasis from the one that she's got here. Yeah.
Yes. I would say that in this way, Judaism and Christianity actually have the
Differ.
same goal.
Oh,
They just have a different manner. Like,
great.
if the goal is to act well and think well, which I think both Judaism and Christianity want to achieve,
Yep.
Judaism does so in the way where you're like forced to act well initially, and then, of course, your thoughts will become clean from that point because
Yeah,
you're
okay.
always concerned with doing good things. And Christianity seems to attack it from the other side,
Yep.
where the goal is to have purity of thought initially, which will lead to good works,
That's lovely.
whatever the phrase is. But
So that's really interesting. You know, it's really interesting, and it makes me think of a place, I can't find it right now, but in this book where Murdoch quotes from a Christian hymn, and the line, if I can remember this, is something like, okay, who sweeps a room, like with a broom, who sweeps a room as for thy laws, meaning God's laws, makes that and the action fine. So it's not just keeping your room clean, but if you're doing it with an eye to God, because it's God's law to keep things, then the action and the action of sweeping and what's going on in your mind are all fine. So does this make any sense? It's actually, the action matters even more because the motive for the action is the right motive.
Is this?
Does that
Oh, sorry.
does that make sense?
Is this kind of platonic because it's like
semi-platonic?
always-
I sometimes think Murdoch is less platonic than everybody thinks she is. I think it's somewhere between Aristotle and Plato, actually, rather than purely platonic. She always is kind of touted as one of the people who turned philosophy a bit back towards Platonism, but I find her kind of Aristotelian and even a bit Wittgensteinian in some ways, the way that she thinks about the outer, which is kind of contrary to what we've been saying as much as she does about the inner. But let me draw your attention to, so the next, have we got time to do one more little bit? Is that all right? So move on. So leave M and D sort of in the background for now, and move on to page 34. This is probably the only other little passage we'll have time for, but try this. Page 34. In fact, I might even get you to start a little bit earlier than that. Let me see if I've got have you got a page 32 there as well?
Yeah.
So look at 32 halfway down on the left-hand side. In the photocopy, you can see my big scribble. So uses of words by persons grouped round a common object is a central and vital human activity. And she says a little bit later, this is 3 lines later, an aesthetic analogy is helpful for morals. M could be helped by someone who both knew D and whose conceptual scheme M could understand, or in that context, begin to understand. And just think back to that bit where she says, D is not vulgar but refreshingly simple, not undignified but spontaneous, not noisy but gay, not juvenile but youthful, and so on and so forth. So now she's saying, so in this case, the persons grouped round a common object, well, D is the common object, but it could be a book. What all of you do in class is using words while grouped around a common object, which is the book. So she's thinking not just about morals, but she's thinking about reading and about language and about how you use language to describe the object that you are looking at, which might be D, or it might be Plato's Republic, or it might be whatever book you're talking about. So that's interesting. So an aesthetic analogy is helpful for morals. Now flip to 34, top of 34. I just want to know what you guys think of this. Words are the most subtle symbols which we possess, and our human fabric depends on them. I think these are really interesting thoughts, because you guys use words. You are kind of the epitome of word-using people. What you're doing in those classes. I sat in on a couple of classes, and you're not doing anything else. You're just using words. That's all you're doing. It's in language. Even the statistics class I went to, which had some terrific graphs, but it was all about the conversation about what the graphs meant, and that was all in language. Anyway, so words are the most subtle symbols which we possess. Our human fabric depends on them. And then she says a few lines later, and you might want to disagree with this, the most essential and fundamental aspect of culture is the study of literature. This is why you see this was so formative for me, this book, because this is what I wanted to do. Since this is an education in how to picture and understand human situations. We are men, this was 50 years ago, we are people, and we are moral agents before we are scientists, and the place of science in human life must be discussed in words. This is why it's more important to know about Shakespeare than to know about any scientist. And here you go, Emma. If there is a Shakespeare of science, his name is Aristotle. From a person who's supposed to be a Platonist, I think that's the most amazing thing to say, right? Then a little bit more. I've used the word attention, which I borrow from Simone Weil, I told you about her a minute ago, to express the idea of a just and loving gaze directed upon an individual reality. I believe this to be the characteristic and proper mark of the active moral agent. So there you go. That's kind of, in some ways, the heart of what she's got to say about morality, but also about language. Over to you.
This just made me have the thought of how effective it is to talk about philosophy with sign language.
With sign language.
Because
I wondered if you'd say that. Yeah. So
I mean,
might be a
yeah.
mathematician.
I don't I don't know much about sign language, but it just seems like you can just make a lot fewer subtleties with your hands versus with all the different syllables and
Sure.
things.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering about
Sign
that.
language can only be a sign
Yeah.
of some much more, what would you say, rich, complex, dense, multi-layered reality. And what do you think? What's your take on this stuff about words and language and attention and all this vocabulary that she's
We can
using?
keep it in the Plato world. Obviously, Plato has the Phaedrus.
Yes,
is-
absolutely. That's a very good example. And she talks.
Reading a lot of Plato
Okay,
right now.
and she talks about the Phaedrus elsewhere. So go on, tell us
that's
about
excellent.
it.
I guess the main idea is just the more we write things down instead of transmitting
Yeah,
things
yeah.
orally, the more our attention decreases and
Yep.
we actually become like this writing becomes a crutch for us.
Right.
We need to take notes.
Yeah.
We need to
Okay.
write and we need to like
Very Phaedrusistic.
things.
Yeah, absolutely. But you know what? You talked about what you lose in, like Socrates says, it's what's written in the soul. Spoken language is what does that, and as soon as you write it down, you lose the force. But the spoken language is still language, right? So when she says words are the most subtle symbols which we possess, she doesn't necessarily mean written words,
But
right?
I mean, I don't exactly agree with the Phaedrus. I do, because a bunch of people here say, the way to learn how to think is if you know how to write well. But also the thing we learned in Boris Fishman's writing class, which was amazing.
Right.
We learned that dialogue is very different. Like you can't just write dialogue like you're writing this or something. It will feel very stiff, and you have to be very. People don't respond to each other properly.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, the logic usually doesn't follow in conversations, especially in my own conversations.
Right.
So, I mean, I think there is definitely something different between the spoken word and the written
There
word.
certainly is. Yeah.
But I still think the written word is like, could she have just spoken all this? Or I guess if she was in Socrates' time, she probably would have had all of the faculties to do so.
Yeah. Could she have spoken this instead of writing it? She probably did speak it to John, her husband. They did talk a lot about each other's writing. But what she says, so that's really interesting, but what she says is as true of spoken language as it is of written language. She just says words. Our human fabric depends on them. So she'd be okay with the Phaedrus. She wouldn't mind if it was spoken, I think. Anyway, what did you think about the idea of a just and loving gaze directed upon an individual reality? This is attention. And making sense of that reality in words. That's what she's really talking about. Anyway, any other thoughts? There's one more little passage because I know we'll have to wind up, but
Is there?
this is kind of the heart of what she says.
Well, is there any other way? So she's saying you can't have an instinctual under. So what would she say about how
You have to put it into language. That's what she's really saying. So if we go back to our first case of you've met somebody and you're not really sure if you like them or not, the only way to make progress with that is to articulate it. That's what she's saying. To find a moral, as rich and as complex a moral vocabulary as you can to articulate what it is that you're feeling and what it is that you're thinking
Is
about.
this kind of like Freud, like the repression?
Talks about him too.
Of like the instinctual. Oh, I don't know a lot about Freud. Even though my grandma was a psychiatrist.
Right. Okay. So that you were kind of inoculated.
Well, my mom says that my grandma says that the most messed up people are the children of rabbis, shrinks, and politicians.
I've heard this said before.
But isn't
Politicians, maybe, definitely.
so? I guess but isn't this kind of Platonic? Because like the wisdom is the highest, so you have to get from bodies to one body to body, then like the custom, then describing all these things.
There's a very Platonic strand in a lot of this as well, even though she says if there is a Shakespeare of science, his name is Aristotle, which is a fantastic sentence. I love that. But yes, she talks later on in the book about intuitions that gradually become more and more convergent on a single good, which is very Platonic. So that's definitely right. Any thoughts? Because I've got one more passage I want to inflict on you guys. Can I do that? So this is, let me just check. This is later on. If you go to page 79, so it's in the final essay. And this is a passage that I've found particularly kind of powerful in my own thinking about both literature and philosophy. So you find 79 and you look at the bottom right-hand corner, the end of 79, where she says, so she's trying to think about, she was an interesting philosopher because she was both in if these words mean anything to you, the existentialist continental school of philosophy and the British analytic Anglo-Saxon tradition, which were two very opposed traditions in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Like Sartre is kind of existentialist. You make the meaning of your life completely out of yourself, which she kind of sees the point of, but in the end says it's not enough. And the analytic tradition says that it's a kind of meta tradition. Moral language is what you talk about. You talk about the meaning of moral concepts, not the actual activity of a moral life, if that distinction makes sense. And she didn't like that either, as you can tell. So she was kind of critical of both those two dominant traditions at the time. So she's talking now about kind of how you produce meaning in your life. The idea of life as self-enclosed, purposeless, a product of the despair of our own age. She's worried about the sense that life is meaningless that she sees around her such a lot. This has a whole era in the history of philosophy, beginning with Kant. The chief characteristic of this phase of philosophy have you read any Kant at all in you? Okay, well then, so keep this in mind when you do get to him, because it might be a useful defense against some of the things that I'm not saying he's a bad guy, but I think some of the tendencies in his thought are rather, what's the word I'm looking for? Solipsistic. They tend to drive you into the individual self, and she's trying to do the opposite. She's trying to get you out of yourself, which is what M is doing in that little story, kind of losing her own prejudices and finding a new sense of what D is actually like. Anyway, Kant, go on over the page, Kant abolished God and made man God in his stead. We are still living in the age of the Kantian man or Kantian man-God. His exposure of the so-called proofs of the existence of God, because Kant disproves a lot of proofs, so-called proofs of God. His analysis of the limitations of speculative reason has had results which might possibly dismay him. And this is the passage. How recognizable, how familiar to us is the man so beautifully portrayed in this book, The Groundwork, it's called. Confronted even with Christ, turns away to consider the judgment of his own conscience and to hear the voice of his own reason. Stripped of the metaphysical background which Kant was prepared to allow him, this man, and she means this human, so does this resonate with you? This model of the modern self is still with us, free, independent, lonely, powerful, rational, responsible, brave, the hero of so many novels and books of moral philosophy, the offspring of the age of science, confidently rational, and yet increasingly aware of his alienation from the material universe which his discoveries reveal. End of paragraph. In fact, Kant's man had already received a glorious incarnation nearly a century earlier in the work of Milton. His proper name is Lucifer. or Satan. And you probably haven't read any Milton. No, not yet. Anyway, so she's trying to paint a picture of what the archetypal modern human being is like. Does this resonate, this picture of free, independent, lonely, powerful, rational, responsible, brave, the hero of so many novels and books of moral philosophy? Does that ring any bells? What do you think of that?
It sounds like Augustine. We just read Augustine's
right,
Confessions.
the Confessions.
Before
that is a
which
very interesting connection to make.
we keep taught in our class. Our teacher's a Platonist. No, he's a little Neoplatonic.
Okay, just a little.
Just a little. We talk about where was I?
Augustine.
Yeah,
Confessions.
Augustine. So he's not exactly the birth of interiority, but he's the intensification of interiority.
Totally.
And everything is just about him being miserable about eating pears that he didn't even like.
Exactly.
And
that's a very interesting thing to connect this with Augustine. I think Murdoch would have agreed with you. She would have, and in fact, I totally agree with you. I mean, I wrote a book where I tried to connect this picture of the Kantian man to Augustine and other people like him. What do you think? Aiton, what do you think of this portrait? Anything that you've read, or novels that you've read, or pictures of the self that sound like this? Do you find this an appealing way to be?
I definitely think this is a great portrayal of what man looks like today.
Good.
There
I
are-
do too, yeah.
There are a few things I obviously don't like about it, as I assume.
Of
Murdoch
course,
would have
as
problems
Murdoch doesn't either. She
Right.
doesn't like this guy. No, definitely not.
Yeah, I have some problems with him too, but I definitely think the free and independent aspects, and obviously I think both of those probably contribute somewhat to the loneliness
Mm-hmm.
that she describes. I think those are like probably very new for humans, to be free
Right,
and independent.
right.
And we all need some guide, which we should freely and independently choose.
Yeah.
In our life, which
Right.
will usually be our parents, hopefully, or a religious guide or a philosophical guide. As I think the philosophical guide makes the most sense in the context of literature and any pipeline into law or other aspect of life that philosophy strongly influences.
Yeah. So I'm hearing both of you recognizing this picture, but also sharing her worry, her concern about this as a picture of modern humanity.
Well, Jordan Peterson says this a lot. but
Okay, yeah, it's
that
an
anxiety
interesting example. Yeah,
is not exactly different from just thinking about yourself. And the more focus you have of yourself, the
Yes.
more neurotic you are, and the more miserable you are.
he
So-
actually says, doesn't he? Sorry, I'm interrupting.
No.
Doesn't he say somewhere that there is no discernible psychiatric difference between thinking about yourself and being miserable?
He says that, yeah.
Right.
Which
It's
I mean,
it's an interesting line.
if you look at like COVID and the lockdowns, like there's no. I think you find the more alone you are, the more alone with your thoughts you are, the more miserable you are. Which that's why I don't understand introverts very much. But introverts, like extroversion, is a propensity for positive emotion. So maybe they're just miserable. But
Yeah, so what are we going to do about introverts? You want to help them get out of there, right?
maybe, I don't know. But I just think
I'm a bit of an introvert. I think about it. Yeah, but it's not.
But then again, like if you look at Walt Whitman or
Yep.
like Emerson, they don't exactly just stay in their house alone. They go in. Maybe they do.
Whitman certainly
But
Song
they-
of Myself, right?
They also go into nature. Well, they also have poems about being a little wanting to. The only thing I remember from that was he wanted to understand everything. I don't remember if he was miserable in it, but they also go out into nature. So there's like our relation with some type of creation or other people
Yep.
is integral to being happy, maybe.
We should wind up, I guess, but I think you both sensed something very important in what Murdoch is trying to say and trying to teach us. And it does have to do with the solitary self and the Freudian ego. She talks about the big fat ego that we all, selflessness, getting out of the ego, is the biggest moral lesson that we all have to learn, according to her. And she actually uses the example of being in nature. I can't find the page, but there's a lovely little passage where she talks about somebody who's feeling lonely and miserable and cranky and not enjoying life, and they suddenly see what she calls a kestrel, a beautiful bird flying across the sky, and it takes them out of themselves. And suddenly all that stuff that was going on in their head is transcended, goes away. And she just uses that as a little example of the many, many ways that you can transcend the self. Go ahead.
Wait, but that's interesting because all the M is doing is writing about her own thoughts
Exactly. Yeah.
and exploring those. So is it not going a little more interior?
Well, what do you think?
instinctual?
I think Em is trying to get out of herself. She's trying to get out of the prison. Doesn't she use right at the beginning the word prison? She's trying to get out of the prison of. Go on.
She's trying to apply reason to her rational.
She's trying to apply a complex moral vocabulary to the mess, to kind of to the prison, as a way of breaking the prison bars.
How is that exactly different from Augustine, like talking and like about the pairs and like the things again and again and again?
That's a very good question. I think she would say that it's precisely that. Think of M as Augustine, right? And Murdoch is trying to say, if only he'd done this, he would have stopped thinking about pairs or whatever it is and started to think about other people, which he does not do in the
You're expecting
Confessions.
that she's making the assumption that this is actually possible. This rational
definitely.
Movement of thought actually can
Verbal.
permanently make a change in your action. But I don't know if that's
This
exactly
is
true.
well, you might be right, but that is very much what she's trying to do. She's trying to say this is how you become good. That's why it's called the sovereignty of good. This is how you get out of. Good is the opposite of the selfish, introverted prison. Good is getting out of it, like the cave. So.
But are simple-minded. This kind of depends on the fact of being able to use this complex moral vocabulary. So what about
exactly.
the simple people that are generally more happy?
That is also in the book. She has a category of person that she calls the virtuous peasant. Right, who doesn't know any of this fancy stuff. But she says, in terms of Plato's cave, she says the virtuous peasant is probably the one that just walks out of the cave without even realizing there was a problem. So, any other thoughts before we wind up?
I have a question.
Sure.
It's a little bit on a different topic, but okay. A few weeks ago, we had Brendan McCord, who is a great speaker at the Builders and Books lecture series, and he was discussing how we had this philosophy to law pipeline, and he wants to create the philosophy to code pipeline.
To code. Right.
Yes.
Interesting.
And you're interested in the intersection of philosophy
And literature.
So can you describe what the value is with adding philosophy into literature and perhaps even adding it to other studies or centers of knowledge?
In a way, kind of the smart answer to that is that's what we've been talking about for the last hour, because Murdoch is using a literary example in the book and then showing how philosophy can build on the literary example and give you a way of thinking morally which will make you a better person. So here's a slightly kind of angled answer to your question. I think one of the ways in which philosophy has gone wrong in the last generation is it does not think enough about this kind of thing. It doesn't think enough about how do we become better people? What is actually good? What is a good person? How can you tell when somebody is a good person? How do you make yourself a better person? Philosophy hasn't done enough of that. And this is why somebody like Murdoch is so important. She's had a whole generation of kind of followers, people who've been driven by her work. Have you come across a book by Charles Taylor, Sources of the Self? Have you heard of this guy? That's something you would actually really, I think you'd really enjoy that. Cora Diamond, have you heard of her? Wittgenstein philosopher. Taylor.
Something of the self.
Sources of the
Could
Self.
also Herbert Spencer. Could that?
but from a much earlier generation.
Okay.
There's
Because the philosophy of style I've read, and that sounds
right.
kind
Okay.
of like it would be on the
Taylor
same brand.
Taylor is like 40 years ago rather than when was Spencer, like 100 and something years
Maybe I
ago.
think it was like 1890 or something.
Yeah. So Taylor is interesting. Martha Nussbaum. Have you heard of her at all? So she's very much in the Murdoch tradition of literature as moral philosophy. So it's kind of an answer to your question in a way. I think philosophy hasn't done enough of this sort of thinking, and there should be more of it. You should have more books like this on your course. I don't know, what philosophy have you read apart from the Plato and Augustine? Anything modern? Any recent philosophers?
This soul.
Shop class.
Yeah.
By Matthew Crawford. It's
Okay.
mostly, we haven't read a lot of philosophy mixed in with other areas of like academic focus. It's
Right.
mostly just pure
Right.
philosophy, like Aristotle, Plato. I guess Augustine is like mixing Christianity with it.
Right.
I've read Philo, who's fun. He's
Yeah.
basically like Greek plus Jewish plus philosophy,
Right. Right.
which is
What else did we read?
But in a way, while you're thinking about that, I'm just still thinking about the question that you asked me. I don't have a kind of convenient encapsulated little answer exactly to your question. It just seems to me that philosophy is what she says here. It's the practice of thinking lovingly and attentively about the object in front of you, not in a scientific sense, but in a moral sense. Thinking about lives, thinking about people's lives with this kind of what she calls just and loving gaze, looking at a life, a group of lives, a way of life in that patient, careful, attentive way. That's what it seems to me philosophy should be adding to whatever conversation you're having. And that's why novels are important, because novels are full of lives. I mean, War and Peace, I don't know whether you guys have read that, or even a Potter novel, which you probably have read, makes you think about the kind of person that Hermione is, or the kind of person that Harry and what's his name, Harry and Ron. Yeah, this is actually the kind of moral object that Murdoch says helps you grow and become more good. So that's why I think philosophy is important. It should be a component of any kind of careful attention that you're paying to any text. You are thinking philosophically when you're thinking carefully and attentively about a text. That is philosophy. So you're doing it all the time in this course, which is such a great course, let me say. Okay, all right.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you guys for talking to me.
Nice.
It's really nice of you to spend time from your reading week doing that.